The applause arrived before the first joke did. It always seemed to. The familiar music faded. The audience was already on its feet. And the energy inside Studio 8H felt like everyone had agreed, at least for the next few minutes, the world's chaos would be easier to digest if it came with a punchline. The cameras settled into place. The lights glowed brightly across the famous Weekend Update desk. Michael Che and Colin Jost took their seats with practiced ease, smiling through another wave of cheers. Che thanked the audience. Jost offered his own greeting. The exchange lasted only a few seconds. It was enough to establish the rhythm. This wasn't a debate. It wasn't a lecture. It wasn't the evening news. It was a place where headlines arrived wearing clown shoes. The first story wasted no time. Breaking news, the audience was told, had arrived just hours earlier. Spirit Airlines had supposedly managed to accomplish something that sounded almost impossible. According to the joke, the airline had permanently shut down in the middle of a flight. The room exploded with laughter. The image alone was absurd enough to work. Thousands of travelers stranded at airports, empty check-in counters, no employees in sight. Passengers searching desperately for someone, Anion, to explain what had happened. Then came the line that completed the joke. Spirit proudly announced they were maintaining their normal level of service. The audience didn't just laugh. They recognized it. Every traveler who's ever stood in a painfully long airport line, every customer who'd stared at an unmanned service desk, every person who'd wondered if anyone actually worked there suddenly understood why that punchline landed so well. Weekend Update had always relied on that formula. Take a headline, twist it just enough. Everyone shared frustration, do the rest, without pausing very long. The broadcast shifted to another headline, this one dramatically darker, before immediately steering into satire. Attention turned toward Cole Thomas Allen, identified in the segment as the alleged correspondent's dinner shooter. The audience's mood briefly tightened. Real-world violence has a way of changing the temperature in any room. The joke wasn't aimed at the seriousness of the allegation itself. Instead, it focused on the bizarre culture surrounding social media. According to the setup, Allen had allegedly taken a selfie inside his hotel room shortly before the attempted attack. Then came the fictional caption attached to that imaginary social media post. Felt cute. Might delete president. Unexpected mashup between influencer language and criminal intent hit the audience sideways. Gasps mixed with laughter. Some people leaned back in disbelief before laughing anyway. Contrast, the collision between internet culture and horrifying reality was exactly what made the joke feel so ridiculous. No lengthy explanation followed. Weekend Update never lingered. One headline gave way to another almost immediately. Next came royalty. King Charles had visited the United States. On paper, it sounded like the sort of diplomatic story that normally earned only a few seconds on an evening newscast. Here, though, diplomacy quickly became comedy. The king, viewers were told, had met Zohran Mamdani during the visit. Came the punchline. The suggestion was that Charles should simply bring Mamdani back to England because he was an Indian treasure. The audience responded with a familiar combination of laughter and exaggerated groans. Weekend Update audiences almost treated groans as applause. The bigger the collective, "Oh, come on," from the crowd, the better the writers usually felt about the joke they had just landed. The next royal headline expanded the visit even further. King Charles, the audience heard, had traveled to commemorate the 250th anniversary of American independence from Britain. History itself became the setup. The irony practically wrote itself. 250 years after losing the colonies, Britain's monarch was now visiting the very nation that had fought to separate itself from the crown. Then the story took another unexpected turn. According to the joke, Charles also came to negotiate the release of a British hostage supposedly being held by an American terrorist. The humor rested entirely on flipping expectations. Americans are used to hearing stories in which their own government negotiates for citizens overseas. Here, the roles had been reversed. Britain was the one trying to retrieve its own citizen from America. The reversal earned another wave of laughter. But the segment wasn't finished with the king, not even close. Another gift exchange entered the story. King Charles reportedly presented President Donald Trump with the original bell from a British submarine on its own that sounded ceremonial enough. Then came the imagined explanation. If you ever need to get a hold of us, Charles supposedly said, just give us a ring. It sounded polite, diplomatic, almost charming. Then Weekend Update added one more twist. The narrator suggested Trump probably wouldn't need the bell at all because he could simply call the contact saved in his phone as Andrew Iceland. That final reference caused the audience to erupt again. No extra explanation was offered. Weekend Update often trusted viewers to understand the implication without spelling it out. The jokes kept moving. The rhythm mattered more than lingering on any single story. Politics soon returned to center stage. Legal experts, the audience heard, believed a recent Supreme Court ruling had dealt a devastating blow to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That sentence sounded remarkably similar to what viewers might hear on a serious cable news panel. Then came the pivot. The ruling had reportedly taken a wrecking ball to the legislation. Another comparison immediately followed. If black Americans were asked, the narrator joked, it felt less like a wrecking ball and more like a fire hose. The audience reacted instantly. Some laughed. Others groaned. A few voices could even be heard responding before the laughter fully settled. The moment carried an unusual tension. One of the hosts acknowledged it with a brief observation. Too real. Acknowledgement became part of the comedy itself. Sometimes the loudest laugh arrived because the audience recognized a painful truth hiding underneath an outrageous joke. There was almost no time to recover before another headline arrived. President Trump had met with the Artemis II astronauts inside the Oval Office. Space exploration usually brings images of scientific achievement, technological breakthroughs, and humanity reaching toward distant worlds. Weekend Update had something much simpler in mind. According to the joke, Trump enthusiastically told the astronauts, I like space. Perfectly ordinary sentence until the punchline arrived. The comment, viewers were told, was actually a direct quote from Melania Trump's wedding vows. The audience laughed before the image had even finished forming. Romantic ceremony reduced to 2 words. An emotional promise transformed into accidental deadpan comedy. That was the strength of Update's setup. No elaborate story. Just one unexpected angle. And another, and another. Each joke lasted only moments before making room for the next headline waiting patiently in line. The pace never slowed. That was one of the defining characteristics of a Weekend Update segment. Every joke had barely enough time to land before the next headline arrived, and every transition felt less like changing subjects and more like changing channels at lightning speed. Created the feeling that the news itself had become a roller coaster, sharp turn after another, with the audience happily hanging on.
The next stop was the Pentagon. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Screen on.
And before any serious point could be made, the image itself became part of the joke. The narrator quipped that the photo looked like it had been taken immediately after a bartender had decided to cut him off. The audience laughed before another word was spoken. It wasn't an analysis of defense policy. It wasn't an argument about military leadership. It was simply a visual observation delivered with perfect timing. That timing mattered. Weekend Update rarely spent much time explaining why something was funny. The writers trusted viewers to connect the dots on their own. The story then shifted to testimony before Congress. According to the setup, Hegseth revealed that the current estimate for the war in Iraq was $25 billion. For a brief second, it sounded like a straightforward budget report. Then came the punchline, a gallon. The room burst into laughter. The joke transformed a staggering government figure into the price of gasoline, exaggerating inflation to such an absurd degree that the audience immediately understood the premise, but the bit wasn't finished. The question followed almost immediately. How had the war already managed to cost $25 billion? The answer wasn't intended to be serious. What are we bombing them with? The narrator wondered, White House ballrooms? The image was ridiculous. Instead of military equipment, Viewers were invited to imagine priceless ballroom interiors somehow being launched across continents. It was exactly the sort of surreal visual that made the joke stick. One headline disappeared, another arrived. This time, the subject became abortion access. A federal appeals court, the audience heard, restricted access by blocking the mailing of a popular abortion medication. Unlike many of the earlier stories, this one began with a noticeably heavier tone. Court rulings rarely invite easy comedy. The room quieted slightly as listeners waited for the turn. Then it came. The narrator reminded everyone that, technically speaking, any drug could become an abortion drug. If someone did enough of it, the audience erupted. A few people clapped enthusiastically. One person in particular could be heard applauding with exceptional confidence. That lone burst of applause immediately became part of the act. The narrator smiled and addressed the room. Yeah, don't. The pause stretched just long enough. One guy clapped. That line generated an entirely new wave of laughter. The audience wasn't simply reacting to the original joke anymore. They were laughing at themselves. It was one of those little unscripted feeling moments that gave Weekend Update its personality. Sometimes the biggest laugh came from acknowledging the crowd. Without missing a beat, attention shifted again. This time, the U.S. State Department entered the conversation. According to the report, a special edition passport featuring an image of President Donald Trump was being introduced. The setup sounded patriotic enough, a commemorative passport. A presidential portrait, then came the twist. The narrator suggested that travelers would always carry a reminder of exactly why they decided to leave the country in the first place. Easter. Another roar of laughter rolled across the studio, but there was still one more observation. Looking at the image, it supposedly appeared as though Trump's photograph was burning a hole through the Declaration of Independence itself. The visual was exaggerated, theatrical, and perfectly suited for television. The audience appreciated the extra layer. Sometimes one punchline wasn't enough. Sometimes the second one landed even harder. The next story headed south. Florida, few places had become as reliable for bizarre headlines in modern comedy. Whenever the words "a man in Florida" appeared in a news story, audiences almost instinctively expected chaos. This report did not disappoint. A homeless man had allegedly been arrested after trespassing aboard a yacht. That alone sounded strange. His explanation made it stranger. He reportedly claimed that he wasn't stealing the yacht at all. He was simply holding it for his friend, President Trump. The audience laughed immediately. The confidence behind such an unbelievable excuse became the joke. Then the report added another detail. Authorities said the man had made several additional unbelievable claims. The narrator offered one example. "I was mayor of New York City." Before the audience had fully processed the line, another twist appeared. The narrator admitted that the delivery had actually been an impression of fellow cast member Kate. The room laughed again. This time, not only at the joke itself, but at the unexpected self-reference. Weekend Update had always enjoyed pulling viewers behind the curtain for just a second before rushing back to the headlines. Politics returned almost instantly. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had suggested that it was entirely possible America had already had a gay president. The statement itself became the setup. The narrator paused for only a heartbeat before offering a guess. Maybe it was the one obsessed with ballrooms and the Village People. The audience reacted with another chorus of laughter and groans. There was no direct accusation, no elaborate explanation. Just a carefully aimed punchline built around familiar public references. The joke trusted the audience to fill in everything left unsaid. Then came another story involving President Trump. According to the report, Trump claimed that a BBC documentary had altered footage of his January 6th speech by using artificial intelligence to change his words. Artificial intelligence had become one of the defining topics of the modern era. People worried about fake videos, fake voices, fake images. Weekend Update decided to imagine what the alleged manipulation might actually look like. The narrator introduced the familiar clip. Trump could be heard saying, we fight like hell." Then the imaginary AI edit arrived. Instead of the original continuation, viewers heard an absurd replacement. And we fight for horny MILFs in your area. The audience exploded. The joke borrowed the language of intrusive internet advertisements, the kind that seemed to appear on questionable websites, and dropped it directly into one of the most recognizable political speeches in recent memory. The collision between the serious and the ridiculous produced one of the loudest laughs of the evening. No one could mistake it for reality. That impossibility was exactly what made it funny. As the laughter slowly settled, the reports surfaced from inside the Trump administration. A new claim suggested that the next major departure might be FBI Director Kash Patel. Political turnover had become such a familiar headline that the audience hardly needed any background. Instead, the focus turned to Patel himself. The narrator observed that he already looked as though he had one eye out the door. It was a visual joke more than anything else. A quick observation, a brief image, one final laugh before the show prepared to move on. The rhythm remained relentless. Every headline served as another stepping stone. Every punchline became a bridge to the next. The audience barely had time to catch its breath before another story was already waiting. By this point, the audience had settled into the familiar rhythm that made Weekend Update feel different from every other news program on television. The headlines were real. The facts being referenced were recognizable. Every story took a sharp turn somewhere between reality and absurdity, landing in a place where the audience could laugh at events that only moments earlier might have seemed far too serious for comedy. The balancing act was the entire point. No single topic stayed on the screen very long. Instead, the show treated the evening's news like a fast-moving parade. Every float had a joke attached to it. Before anyone could think too hard about the previous one, the next had already rolled into view. As the segment approached its conclusion, entertainment replaced politics for one final headline. Attention turned to the new movie Michael. The report noted that the film had earned an impressive $97 million during its opening weekend, making it the highest-grossing opening ever for a music biopic. On its face, it sounded like the kind of Hollywood success story that might dominate an entertainment program, a record-breaking debut, packed theaters, a major audience turnout for a brief moment. The audience simply absorbed the accomplishment. Then Weekend Update did what Weekend Update always does. It found another angle. The narrator observed that, impressive as the box office number was, it still didn't rank among the 10 highest-grossing weekends involving Michael Jackson. There was an instant beat of recognition. Then came the laughter. Some audience members laughed immediately. Others reacted with the unmistakable groan that accompanies a joke so unexpected that it almost catches people off guard. The punchline depended entirely on the audience recognizing the darker historical reference without the show needing to explain it. That restraint had always been part of the format. The writers rarely over-explained. If a joke required 2 extra sentences of clarification, it usually wasn't the right joke for Weekend Update. Instead, the line landed, the audience reacted, and the show trusted viewers to connect the remaining dots themselves. It was a fitting final note for the evening, not because it was necessarily the biggest laugh, not because it was the sharpest political jab, but because it perfectly illustrated the show's entire philosophy. Take a headline. Twist it sideways, deliver the punchline, move on. Looking back over the segment, the range of subjects covered in just a few minutes was remarkable. Air travel, crime, international diplomacy, the British monarchy, American independence, presidential meetings, voting rights, space exploration, defense spending, court rulings, government agencies, Florida oddities, Congress, artificial intelligence, the FBI, Hollywood. Each story could have occupied an entire television panel discussion somewhere else. Here, each one became a setup for a joke. That constant movement created a strange but effective kind of momentum. The audience never knew what headline was coming next. 1 minute, they were picturing abandoned airport terminals after the fictional collapse of Spirit Airlines. The next, they were imagining a social media selfie caption that sounded more like an influencer's post than a criminal's alleged actions. Moments later, they were following King Charles across the Atlantic, only to find themselves laughing at the image of a submarine bell and an imaginary contact list on a presidential phone. The emotional gears shifted just as quickly. A serious legal discussion about voting rights transformed into a joke that prompted both laughter and uncomfortable recognition. Oval Office meeting with astronauts became an opportunity to poke fun at a remarkably simple sentence. Defense spending became a joke about inflation. A court ruling became a joke about drugs. A passport became a punchline. A yacht trespasser became the center of an absurd political fantasy. Artificial intelligence became the vehicle for one of the night's most ridiculous imagined edits. Even Hollywood's biggest opening weekend wasn't immune from becoming the final laugh. Through it all, the audience played an essential role. Their reactions weren't merely background noise. The laughter became part of the pacing. Groans became part of the comedy. Even the single audience member whose enthusiastic applause stood out after the abortion drug joke accidentally contributed to one of the night's funniest exchanges. Spontaneity gave the segment its unmistakable personality. No matter how carefully the jokes were written, they always felt just a little bit alive once they reached a room full of people. Some jokes landed instantly. Others built over the course of a few seconds. A few earned laughs only after the audience realized what had just been said. That delayed reaction often became the loudest one. The hosts never seemed rushed. Even though the material moved at remarkable speed, years of experience made the rapid-fire delivery feel effortless. Every pause seemed intentional. Every glance carried its own punchline. Every transition arrived just before the previous joke had completely disappeared. That precision is easy to overlook because it feels so natural. But it's the product of timing more than anything else. Comedy, especially on a live show, depends on rhythm. A joke delivered 1 second too early can feel confusing, 1 second too late, and the audience has already moved on. Weekend Update has always lived inside that narrow window where timing transforms words on a page into laughter inside a studio. As the final applause began to rise once again, the evening's headlines had already started to blur together into one larger memory. No one in the audience would likely remember every transition word for word. They didn't need to. What remained was the experience. The image of an airline somehow shutting down in mid-flight, the impossible confidence of fictional social media captions, a royal visit reframed through satire, political news compressed into quick, clever observations. Government announcements treated with equal parts skepticism and silliness. Technology turned into parody. Entertainment ending the night with one final unexpected twist. For a few minutes, overwhelming flood of daily headlines had been reorganized into something else entirely. Not a lecture, not a policy debate, not an argument over who was right or wrong. Just a rapid succession of jokes that encouraged the audience to view the news through a different lens, where absurdity was acknowledged instead of ignored, and where laughter became the common thread connecting stories that otherwise had little in common. Applause grew louder. The cameras prepared to move on. Another edition of Weekend Update had done exactly what generations of viewers had come to expect. It gathered together the week's biggest headlines, filtered them through sharp satire, mixed in quick visual gags, unexpected comparisons, and perfectly timed one-liners, and left the audience laughing all the way to the next segment. For one more night, news had been transformed into comedy, and the comedy had reminded everyone that sometimes the fastest way to process an unbelievable week is simply to laugh at how unbelievable it all sounds.